EFF, viva! Forward to victory, forward! Forward to victory, forward! Manda! Away, two! Now thank you very much, fighters and the Commissar Saint Matthias, who is the convener, coordinator of the elections task force here in the province of the Eastern Cape. The regional chairperson, I saw Commissar Polita Mare here, and the provincial secretary, and all the fighters who are in the provincial elections task force, the regional elections task force, but most importantly ourselves, ground forces, disciplined forces of the EFF. We send our greetings on this very important occasion, which we say is going to be the public address on the 30 years of the so-called freedom. All of us would know by now that on Saturday, the 27th of April 2024, South Africa will be marking 30 years of the so-called freedom, because 30 years ago, on the 27th of April 1994, there were elections in South Africa, which got to include everyone. Before that, there were elections that were only contained for white people only. There were many elections where whites only were allowed to vote, and black people were not allowed to vote in South Africa. And after years of struggles against colonialism and apartheid, such culminated or ended up in 1994 with the first inclusive elections where all people were allowed to participate in elections. That marked centuries of years, centuries where black people were treated as subhuman here in South Africa. And how did that come about? It came about since the advent of what is called colonialism. The reason why fighters, we have to pause today, even when it's in the evening, to talk about the so-called Freedom Day, is because during the course of this coming weekend, there will be so many analysts on television, on radio. There will be so many rallies which will be saying to us that we must celebrate the so-called freedom, which will explain in clearer context and which will explain in the founding of the EFF that this so-called freedom is truly not freedom, because it does not have economic emancipation. But before we get to that, there are certain myths or lies that are told about the so-called freedom in South Africa. There are several things which are a deliberate mischaracterization of the so-called end of apartheid in South Africa. Number one, they say that 1994, 27 April represented the defeat of apartheid and racism. All of us know that the end of apartheid did not end apartheid in real terms. It did not end racism. That is line number one, which many people are going to talk about, that 30 years ago apartheid ended. It did not end, it took a different form. It took economic apartheid, because those that used to benefit under legislated apartheid, which was apartheid which was law, continue to benefit even when those laws were statutorily removed and society is going ahead. But also there are those who mischaracterize South Africa's transition from apartheid to the so-called democracy. There are those who are also saying that The end of apartheid meant the end of racial capitalism. The end of apartheid in South Africa did not end racial capitalism. And it is not very difficult to see that racial capitalism is a reality in South Africa. If you were to check the 3 richest human beings in South Africa, which is Nicky Oppenheimer, Johann Rupert, and Koos Becker, it's white males. They've got more wealth than more than 30 million people in South Africa. So all of us here and many others, 26 to 30 million people, are poorer than 3 human beings who are white, who gained their wealth under apartheid and colonialism. What that means is that if we're to combine everything else that we have as black people, our phones, our houses, our cars, everything else that we have, and if we're to sell all of those, the money which we can generate is not equal to the money of just 3 individuals in South Africa. And this is the wealth which they gained through colonialism and exclusion of black people. The other lie that is told about South Africa and the 1994 27 April story, they say it brought about the so-called Rainbow Nation. That South Africa is a united country in diversity, that all of us are living in harmony together with white people and everyone else. But it is beyond any doubt now that that is not the case. We are not a rainbow nation that is worth celebrating. The other situation that is mostly said about this South Africa's transition from apartheid to this system that we have now. You will hear so many people in the world, in the white world, they say South Africa experienced a peaceful transition. They say Mandela created a peaceful transition. There was so much peace. That is why Mandela must be celebrated as a hero. But the transition of South Africa was not peaceful. Just between 1990, when political prisoners were released in 1994, more than 20,000 black people were killed in political violence in South Africa. But the white media and everyone else say that this was a peaceful transition. Do you know why they say it's a peaceful transition? It's because no white person was killed. Because no white people were killed, there was no attempt to overthrow the colonial and apartheid regime and government. So then they say it's peaceful transition, which was ushered in by Nelson Mandela, the man of peace. And that is not the case. South Africa's transition was a very painful, violent transition. And the violence was sponsored by the white-only government, which was under the presidency of F.W. de Klerk. But how did we get to that situation? So, before 1652, most history books in South Africa, they tell the history of South Africa as if South Africa started in 1652. But before 1652, our forefathers, the people that we come from, all of us who are staying in South Africa here, were inhabitants of this place we call South Africa today. They had their own systems, they had their own agriculture, they had their own economy. They owned their own land, they owned the livestock, they had everything else. There is even now evidence that they were able to produce minerals, gold, and even trade with other parts of the world. It was not only with the arrival of white people that we were able to extract minerals. In this country we call South Africa today, it has always been there. But when the colonialists arrived in 1652, they got to defeat all of us They conquered us. They took our land. They took our animals. They took our natural resources. They took our identity. They just made us to be slaves in our own land. And this happened in 1652. They conquered us in 1652. Literally all inhabitants were subjected to white rule, minority rule in South Africa. And since that conquest, since they took over our land, they took over everything from us, we have not yet recovered as black people. We have not yet fought back successfully to reclaim which was taken from us by the colonial invaders. So the EFF says in its founding manifesto that we are moving from the premise and analysis that we are still a conquered people, that the struggle that we are fighting as the economic freedom fighters builds on the walls of resistance against colonialism, builds on those that fought against oppression and apartheid. We are just part of a generation that says, let us take the struggle forward against colonialism, against land dispossession, against dispossession of our identity and humanity as black people. That is where we are coming from, because we are still a conquered people. And how do you see that? More than 80% of South Africa's land is still in the hands of the descendants of the colonial invaders, those that took our land by force. And when here in South Africa there was discovery of diamonds in Kimberley and discovery of gold in the Witwatersrand, now which is called Johannesburg, a larger number of colonial settlers began to come to South Africa. The reason why South Africa has got the largest white population was mostly because of the discovery of diamonds and discovery of gold and discovery of many other mineral resources. And then the colonialists came in their numbers. Now in the late 1800s, the white colonial settlers who came from Netherlands or from the Dutch, who were speaking what they call Afrikaans now as their language, they started to have a fight with the colonial settlers who came from Britain, who speak English. So in the late 1800s, they had something called the Anglo-Boer War, which was the war supposedly between the English-speaking white people and the African-speaking white people. And in that war, a lot of black people were sent, were abducted to be forced to be soldiers on either part of the war. So the Anglo-Boer War, it was not just white people fighting amongst each other. It was also black people being forwarded to fight white people's war. And then in 1902, in the year 1902, these white people say, let's stop fighting, let us unite to oppress black people together. And then they said, let us actually unite all these areas of Transvaal, of the Orange River Colony, which is the Free State now, of the Cape and of Natal to form one country. But let's agree as white people that our common purpose and agenda is the oppression of black people. And in that settlement, they always say that they are going to account to the British government. The British government was a colonial power which was supplying white people here in South Africa with guns and protected them in their oppression of black people. Then they started the negotiations of saying they are going to form one country out of what were 4 territories. The Transvaal is currently Gauteng, Northwest, Limpopo and Mpumalanga. included the Northern Cape, Eastern Cape, and the Western Cape. Natal is currently the current KwaZulu-Natal, and the Orange River colony is the Orange Free State. But there were four separate territories. Then these white people there, their own small governments in each and every of the four territories. But after they won, they then said, let us unite and form one country, which we are going to call the Union of South Africa. And for them to form this country called the Union of South Africa, they went to the British Parliament to pass a law to establish South Africa. So South Africa of white people was established by a British Parliament. And then they said amongst themselves that because they've united the four colonies, the capital city will be Pretoria in terms of where the head of state and government will be. And then they said the legislative capital where the laws will be made will be the Cape in Cape Town. And then they said the judicial capital will be the Free State in Bloemfontein. It is still the case even now. They then agreed on the suppression of black people as a collective. So this Union of South Africa was launched in the year 1910, in March 1910, to say that white people are forming a white-only government to oppress all black people. They said they don't recognize all of us, everyone else who looks like me and you was not recognized as a human being. We're just treated as cheap and easily disposable laborers who must be employed and be paid almost nothing to work in the mines. And when majority of black people were refusing to go and work for white people, and correctly so, because black people had their own land, they had their own means of survival, then the white government passed a law called the Glen Act of Parliament, which was a law that started to impose taxes on black people, to say, as a black person, you are compelled every month to pay some money to the white government. And then that forced a lot of black people to wage labor, which was not part of the African system before the arrival of colonial settlers. And in 1910, the Union of South Africa was formed as a white-only government. And in reaction to that, as a response to the formation of the Union of South Africa, I want to tell you, must pay attention to this, it's very important. Black people said, let us form an organization that is going to ask for participation in the Union of South Africa. And that organization was the South African Natives National Congress, which later on was named the African National Congress. There are two problematic things of what happened with the formation of the South African Natives National Congress. When the ANC was formed, they were never demanding one person, one vote. They never accepted the equality between black people and white people. And that is a fact. What the original demands of the ANC when it was formed were, they were saying, at least allow us the educated black men, allow us, those of us who have gone to school, to participate in the union government of white only. Don't treat us like the other people who stay in rural areas. Don't treat us like people who are not educated. And with the formation of the SANNC, which is the ANC now, they also recognized Britain as the colonial power over South Africa. Their methods of struggle was to send letters and to send delegations to Britain to go and beg the Queen there that please allow us, the educated ones, to participate in the Union of South Africa. We honor you, Queen of England. You are our Queen. That is what their formation was all about. So, and many people they always distort history because they want to portray this picture that they had a seamless, they had an uninterrupted revolutionary character. They never had a revolutionary character. Do you know, many people do not know that the founding president of the South African Natives National Congress, John Langalibalele Dube, although they still celebrate him as their first president, he did exactly what former President Jacob Zuma is doing now when he left as the president of the SANNC. He went to form another organization called Congoloso Yase Natal. So it's not the first time that a former president of the ANC goes to form an organization which was contesting against the South African Natives National Congress. But there was never anything revolutionary about what they were doing. If you check, so if you check in the ANC, they said they're going to the 52nd, 54th Congress. If you go and check what was happening in the first conferences, first, second, the 40th, 50th, all of those conferences in between, and check who were the people who were speaking in those conferences. Who was opening those conferences? It was the ministers of the apartheid government. All the congresses of the ANC were opened by the ministers of native affairs of the apartheid government. They were never a consistently revolutionary movement. But then what happened? In 1944, a younger generation within the South African Natives National Congress, which was then called the ANC from 1937, they then said they are going to form a Congress Youth League whose motto and struggle clarion call was freedom in our lifetime. And who are the people who started that? It was Anton Lembede, it was Robert Mangalisosogube, it was Congress Bata, it was Polis Majongos, it was Walter Sisulu, Oliver Tambo, Nelson Mandela, Albertina Sisulu. A younger generation in their 30s, in their 20s, they say, we can't continue to accept the white government as a government of all of us, side that we even allow them in our conferences, we write letters to them, side that we even comply with the laws that they are passing. Then they say the clarion call of that generation of 1944 is freedom in our lifetime. And we must say here that the inspiration of economic freedom in our lifetime is inspired by that fearless generation. Of course, some components of that generation went to different directions. Far much early in the beginning, they then started with freedom in our lifetime campaign and program. And their major program which they carried out in South Africa was the Defiance Campaign, which was to say we're defying these apartheid laws because in any way we're not part of making these laws. And then they mobilized the whole of South Africa for the adoption of the Freedom Charter. The Freedom Charter which says South Africa belongs to all who live in it, black and white. And as a result of that generation of freedom in our lifetime was split. Robert Mangalisosogube, Edwin Da, they said we do not associate with this South Africa belongs to all who live in it, black and white, because this country is for us as black people. It's not for black and white, it's for black people. We must treat these ones who came as colonial settlers as such. That is how later on the Pan-Africanist Congress of Tanzania was formed, because of the differences on the interpretation of the Freedom Charter. the mineral wealth beneath the soil, the banks and monopoly industries must be transferred to the ownership of the people as a whole. And it also says that there's no government that can claim authority over the people unless it is voted by all of them. Then the then sitting government of apartheid charged everyone through criminal charges who was ascribing to the Freedom Charter or who had a copy of the Freedom Charter in what was called the treason trial. So everyone else who subscribed to the Freedom Charter was charged under treason, that we ascribe to the Freedom Charter, so we're going to charge you. And at that time, the sitting president of the ANC was a guy from Oxford in the Free State called J.S. Moroka. When they were charged, he was charged as well as part of those who owned the Freedom Charter. And then he organized his own lawyers, he left everyone else, he went to court and said he is not part of this Freedom Charter, he was misled by these radicals of freedom in our lifetime. He actually said to the court judge that I actually love white people, I don't have a problem with white people, I'm actually very friendly with them. I'm not against white oppression. And this is a J.S. Moroka which the ANC continues to celebrate up to this day, who betrayed the struggle at the most critical moment. And then in the 1960s, when Umkhonto we Sizwe was formed, so there was a discussion in the liberation movement that what do we do, because these people are becoming repressive, they are arresting political activists. And then there was a discussion that a military wing must be formed. Umkhonto we Sizwe, not the MKP of today. Umkhonto we Sizwe, which was formed to say, let us take up arms to fight physically against apartheid. So MK, which was the military wing, which was started by Nelson Mandela and many other people who belonged to the Communist Party, decided we were going to confront the apartheid regime physically and fight against their system physically. The only philosophical problem with the formation of Umkhonto we Sizwe, they were saying that they are not going to kill white people. They were saying they are going to bomb power stations, bomb bridges, bomb the infrastructure of the white establishment, but they must not kill white people. That is why the struggle never succeeded so much quicker in South Africa, because Umkhonto we Sizwe were fighting against objects and infrastructure, not fighting against people. When the apartheid regime was ready to shoot and kill our people who were defenseless. The apartheid regime killed people in Sharpeville who never had guns. The apartheid regime killed young kids in 1976 in the Soweto uprising. Shamelessly so, but we had a military wing of a so-called revolutionary movement, whose philosophy was that don't kill people, just bomb power stations and power lines. And such is going to bring an end to apartheid. And I'll tell you what is the difference about that. Because Umkhonto we Sizwe and the ANC went to exile earlier. They were joined by the forces of ZAPU and Zebra from Zimbabwe. Those ones in Zimbabwe were fighting against colonialism in Zimbabwe. They were killing everything. They were not separating. They said, if you represent the regime, we're going to shoot to kill. As a result, Zimbabwe got to gain its freedom far much earlier than South Africa in 1980. Because they were ready to shoot and kill. And the colonial regime was saying, let's now go and negotiate because our people are dying. But here in South Africa, we had a so-called military wing who were in Angola, were in Tanzania, were in Uganda. The only thing they were mastering was to sing revolutionary songs. And that is why for many years, many people were arrested, taken to Robben Island. Many people were exiled, went to different parts of the world, running away from a white-only government. But in the mid-80s, in the middle of the 80s, the 1980s, apartheid began to end, and I'll tell you at least what were the 4 reasons why apartheid began to crumble. One was that after the 1976 student uprising in Soweto, a lot of young people on the ground were agitated. They were always in protest action to delegitimize the apartheid regime. There was increased internal resistance against apartheid in South Africa. From 1976 to the extent that the sitting government was declaring state of emergency to say we are no longer applying any law, we arrest everyone that we meet on the street and we suspect of being a terrorist. So the 1976 uprisings in Soweto led to recurrent and rolling mass actions and militancy amongst young people to pressurize the apartheid government to capitulation, to surrender that we must end this apartheid. But the second reason is something called international isolation. All over the world, people were condemning apartheid and colonialism of South Africa to say, you cannot treat black people as subhumans. You must allow for the freedom and democracy for black people. So the isolation of South Africa led to the pressure on the apartheid government to want to pull back against the oppression that was happening. I said the number one pressure was the rolling militancy of young people in South Africa that say apartheid must go. There were so many struggles that got to happen. And by the way, we must say this as the EFF that at the coordination of the internal struggles against apartheid, the militancy against apartheid, was Mama Matikizela Winnie Mandela. Unapologetically so. They took her out of Soweto because they knew that she was the one who was firing up the young revolutionary activists who were making apartheid ungovernable and the apartheid system unworkable. Then they did a house arrest for her. They took her to the Free State in a small town called Brentford and built there a house there and said to her, you are not allowed to leave this place. I can tell you now without any fear of contradiction that Mama Nomzamo, Winfred Matikizela Mandela, fought against apartheid more than all those people who were in prison and those who were in exile. Those ones who were in prison, they were playing football and talking politics, theory every day without teaching in any way. They couldn't do anything. Those who were in exile, they were just singing. But Winnie Matikizela Mandela confronted apartheid regime internally here in South Africa. And that is part of the reasons why the apartheid regime should engage directly even with the apartheid forces. Those of you who can gain access, you must go and read the summary of the book of how she would even engage with the then sitting Minister of Defense on the need to release Nelson Mandela from prison. And so the second issue was the international isolation. So the same thing which was saying must be done to Israel now, that because there is apartheid Zionism in Israel, many parts of the world had banned South Africa's products, had banned any trade relationships with South Africa.
Then the capitalists here in South Africa realized that we are not going to make any business because there is too much international isolation and there is solidarity movement against apartheid. So that is one of the second aspects why apartheid got to be defeated. The third aspect is one thing which majority of us do not know but we will know about today, and when we have got time we will read further about it, was the Battle of Quito Conoval. So Quito Conoval is a small village in Angola. So as part of fighting against freedom and democracy in South Africa, the apartheid regime would go all over the African continent to fight against governments that were supporting the liberation movements. So they would go to Mozambique to fight against Samora Machel's government because it had some association and support for the liberation movement. They would go and fight against King Sokuza in Swaziland. They would go to Botswana to fight against the Kamas when they were still progressive. They would go to Zimbabwe to try to destabilize Zimbabwe. To the extent that in Mozambique, when Mozambique gained its freedom, the apartheid government was sponsoring a rebel group called Renamo to fight against the Frelimo government so that there is no peace in Mozambique, so that there is no support that is given to the liberation movement. They tried to do the same thing in Zimbabwe. They were doing the same thing in Angola. Then in Angola, the Cuban government of Fidel Castro said we are never going to allow apartheid to destabilize Angola to suppress the liberation movement. And Commandant Fidel Castro from Cuba is very far, sent ships with thousands, hundreds and thousands of soldiers and armaments to go and fight against the apartheid regime in Angola in a battle of Quito Conoval. Apartheid tried to reinforce, send a lot of these white kid soldiers to fight against the Cubans. But a lot of apartheid soldiers were defeated, were killed in Quito Conoval. And there were even official negotiations of how to end the war in Quito Conoval, which involved Cuba, it involved the South African apartheid government, it involved Angola, it also involved the United States of America, because they said that battle must come to an end. And what was the product and the agreement of the negotiations of Quito Conoval was one, because also the country which we call Namibia today was under the sub-colonial management of apartheid South Africa. They said you must grant Namibia independence now and you must start negotiations to end apartheid in South Africa. So when Namibia gained its independence, it used to be called the Southwestern Africa. When Namibia gained its independence, the keynote speaker there with the Cuban generals who were commanding the army in Quito Conoval, who said we emancipated you. Namibia still has got very strong relations with Cuba up to this day. And Commandant Fidel Castro said that if within the next 2-3 years there is no formal discussions that start between apartheid generals and apartheid people and the liberation movement, we are going to bring the Cuban soldiers to come and fight apartheid physically in South Africa. That is how they got to be pressurized into submission. So every time we say as the EFF or a July 26 movement that is inspired by Fidel Castro by Che Guevara is because we honor the heroism, the courage, the assistance that came from the Cuban government. Because we openly embrace that relationship that we have with Cuba. The other aspect, fighters, which we must admit, also contributed to the rapid end of apartheid, is that the capitalists, the bourgeoisie, those who own the means of production under apartheid, the Oppenheimers, the Ruperts, saying to their puppets in government that it looks like this apartheid thing is going to cost us business. So we will have to substitute you with a black government and we'll continue to do business as usual. They say the capitalists, those who own the land, who own the mines, who own everything, they say to the apartheid government of border of the flag that let's allow you to go, we'll put black puppets there. We will give them political power, but we're going to retain economic power. And then they started negotiations with liberation movements. It is not a secret, it's a record now, that the first delegation to meet with the ANC in exile was a delegation of Anglo-American of the Oppenheimers, who said, we are going to, what do you want? We can give you political power, but don't disturb our business. And then they went to Nelson Mandela, who was in prison for 18 years. And the other years he spent in a house in Cape Town. But because he was arrested, they said no, he spent 27 years in prison. But he spent 18 years, 9 years he was in a house. They went to him and said, they engaged him until he capitulated that. That's why let's go and do negotiations for this democracy to happen. But by the time negotiations happened for democracy to happen in South Africa, the conclusions were already made. There was already a resolution of what is going to happen. We were told a dummy. They said this is true freedom. We saw the dummy, they said, no, let's negotiate. Then they went to put their side. And once everything else was now settled, now they knew that they can take the economy and give black people political power. Then they said there is only one problem which we must resolve. And that problem was Martin Tembisile and Chris Hani. They said that we hear you, Mandela, we have agreed with you, but we have not had any agreements in public or in secret with Martin Chris Tembisile Hani. And he is very popular within the ANC. If you go yourself, this man is going to take over the ANC. He's going to reverse everything else that we have agreed with all of you. And then they said, how do we deal with the Chris Hani question? Even when they had a draft interim constitution and everything else, the only question that was remaining was the Chris Hani question of how do we deal with the Chris Hani question. And you know what they did with Chris Hani on the 10th of April 1993? They killed him. They assassinated Chris Hani. And when Nelson Mandela went to television, he called for peace and said that let us use this opportunity to announce an election date. Because now Chris Hani is dead. They killed Chris Hani because he was not compromising principle on the altar of political convenience. Chris Hani was not retreating on the fact that we must have free education for all. He was not retreating on the fact that we must nationalize the mines, the banks and monopoly industries. He was not tiptoeing around the capitalist. He said, we want this wealth for all of South Africa, not just for few individuals. So they had to kill Chris Hani to announce the election date, which they say is the 27th of April, 1994. And of course, elections happened. There were no voters rolls that time. Everyone with an ID could just go and vote. And then the ANC won. The National Party of the Clerk became number 2. And then they formed the government of national unity. And you must see what happens in the first cabinet of Nelson Mandela. For the Ministry of Finance, which we are going to take after the 29th of May, he announced Derek Kiss. He took an apartheid Minister of Finance to retain in the first cabinet of Mandela. The apartheid Finance Minister became the new Democratic Dispensation Minister of Finance. The Minister of Land Affairs under President Mandela was a guy called Clive van Wicker, an African Arab who was there to safeguard the land ownership of the white minority. The Minister of Mineral Resources was Big Water. So that they were saying that yes, we have given you political power, but the economy don't come anywhere close to it. And that compromise of 1994 is what got us into powerlessness as the black majority. It's what we diagnosed 20 years later. So if you look into the founding manifesto of the EFF, we say that these compromises that have been made have compromised our struggle. This thing of just taking political power without economic power means absolutely nothing. That is why then the EFF was formed. 20 years after the so-called democracy, after the so-called freedom, to say that now let us fight for economic freedom in our lifetime. And we purposely took inspiration from the generation of Anthony Lambert and Policy Majobo's Comrade, of those that said freedom in our lifetime, because that generation is the one that ultimately got to lead South Africa to political so-called freedom. And then ourselves will say that in this relay race of struggle, we should take the baton and we must run towards the finish line, which is economic freedom in our lifetime. So relay race fighters is when you watch Olympics, and then we have got a country which is represented by 4 runners, but different countries have got 4 runners each. The first one runs and hands over the baton to the next one and hands over the baton until the last runner runs to the finish line. What we realized as the economic freedom fighters was that those who took the baton and were supposed to come to hand it over to us to run towards the finish line, they were running back to the opposite direction. They took the baton and ran back. So we had to go and forcefully take that baton to now run towards the finish line, which is economic freedom in our lifetime. And we do not need any permission to fight towards economic freedom in our lifetime. We do not need any approval from anyone. We are building on the struggles against colonialism. We are fighting on those that fought the wars of resistance against colonial invasion. That is why at the center of the struggle for economic freedom in our lifetime is the expropriation of land without compensation for equal redistribution. It's the nationalization of mines, banks, and other strategic sectors of the economy for equal redistribution. It's the building of state capacity and and gradual abolition of tenders. The struggle for economic emancipation is contained in the 7 cardinal pillars for economic freedom in our lifetime. Everything else that we do is towards economic emancipation. And one thing which we must say, fighters, is that we as a generation are taking up a very important struggle that will require a lot of discipline, but it will require a lot of consistency and reliability. And why do we need that? It's because we say in our founding principles that we must build state capacity and gradually abolish tenders. Wait until you are in government, you are a minister or MEC or MMC. These people of tenders will come to you and say, don't you want a car? Don't you want to build a house next to the beach? Don't you want to go to holiday in America? We can give you money, but stop this thing of wanting to abolish tenders. They will say to you that we are running a security company. There is no need to insource a security company into the employ of the government here in Buffalo City. They will say, you know, I am making 15 million every month out of Buffalo City for security. And you as the MMC, if you stop this thing of building state capacity and insourcing of security guards, I'm going to give you 1 million every month. And then you will see fighters coming into meetings and say, Comrade, I thought maybe this issue of building state capacity must look at it differently. He said, in any way, the founding manifesto says correct one, so let's do correct one. We must not do it now. And that is when we are going to be able to distinguish opportunists in the movement from those who are fighting for true economic emancipation in our lifetime. The opportunists and staff writers will always fall for tenders. They will always sacrifice principle on the altar of political convenience. They will give all sorts of reasons and say, no, these people are actually funding the movement. Let's allow these tenders to continue. And what does the continuation of some of these tenders mean? In many instances, they mean the dehumanization of our people. In Johannesburg, when we partially had control over Herman Mashaba there, when he was the mayor, we insourced security guards. You know, the city of Johannesburg was paying a private company 15,000 rand every month per security guard. But those security guards were paid 2,500 in an envelope by the security companies. But once we insourced them, there is no security guard in the city of Johannesburg who is insourced, whose overall salary is less than 10,000 rand per month. And they've got leave days, they've got proper medical benefits. They are treated with dignity. And that is what this organization is all about, bringing dignity to the lives of our people. We are speaking here today, fighters, that a lot of our people do not live in dignity. That is why every so-called Freedom Day, we ask the simple question of, what is this freedom when people do not have proper decent houses? What is this freedom when people do not have basic accessible drinkable water? How do we celebrate the freedom when people cannot gain access to education which is meant to liberate them? How do we celebrate this freedom when women and children are not safe in our communities? What are we free from? And that is what we should all of us know, that they will be going all over to waste government money in the so-called Freedom Day. But we, as the economic freedom fighters, as the economic emancipation movement, a pan-Africanist, socialist, revolutionary movement, we must never be fooled to believe that we have attained freedom because we have not yet attained freedom. We are the ones who are the true freedom fighters. We are the ones who are going to bring about true freedom, which will mean equality economically between all races. We are unapologetic that we want to be equal in terms of economic power to white people, if not better than them, because this is our land. And we must be unapologetic about that. And how do we get there? We utilize political power. And how do we get political power? You get political power through the masses, through people behind you. The masses must be. In a revolution, the number of people that follow you matters. So in a revolution, size matters. I don't know why it doesn't matter, but in a revolution, it does matter. The number of people who are supporting you. But how to get the masses behind us is to have a strong organization that is disciplined. We need organizational power to gain mass power, and mass power will give us political power. And with political power will be having state power. And with state power, we're going to take over the economy and give to our people. The work which we are doing every day as ground forces of the EFF is the most elementary and most important work in the struggle for economic emancipation in our lifetime. We might not say this to you every day, but the work of talking to people, of wearing regalia, of convincing as many people as possible to come to the movement, that is very important. We appreciate that. And that is what is going to collectively give us some success in the future. Don't underestimate the work and the contributions that we are making to the movement. When you look back in 10 years, 15 years time, when the EFF has won decisively all elections in South Africa, not only in South Africa, in Namibia, in Botswana, and everywhere where the EFF exists, you will say that we actually came a long way. At some stage we sat at Gompo Hall for the whole night talking about politics, and food was even delayed, but we were there. That is the contribution that we make in the struggle for economic freedom in our lifetime. So fighters do not want to keep each other for a very long time. We just thought, let's just share some words about freedom in our lifetime and economic freedom in our lifetime, but also expose the 30 years of the so-called freedom. Our freedom is still coming, it has not yet arrived. That is why we must fight relentlessly, we must fight every day. Every day we must win new and new people to our side until we achieve victory. And we can assure you, without any fear of contradiction, that victory is certain. Thank you very much, Mata Samantha. Viva EFF, viva! Viva EFF, viva! Viva EFF, viva! Forward to real freedom, forward! Forward to real freedom, forward! Amanda! Away, two! Batulenge basitiniso awulendao sibukuyo batulenge basitiniso awulendao sibukuyo
Tshivambu.
Coordinator.